Hey, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Welcome to today's webinar on urban cooling. My name is Karishma Asarpura, and I'm an officer with the Climate Action Team at the ICLEI World Secretariat based in Bonn. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar organized by UrbanShift in collaboration with Energy Exchanges. Next slide, please. Okay, before we get started, I'd like to go over a few technical details. Today's webinar will be available in English, Mandarin Chinese, and Bahasa Indonesia. Please click on the interpretation symbol, that's the little globe icon in your control panel to select your preferred language channel. We also want to inform you that this webinar is being recorded and the recordings in all the languages will be shared shortly after the event. Next slide, please. So if you have any questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A box. You may send in your question at any time during the webinar, and we will try and answer them via the chat or during the Q&A at the end. Next slide, please. Okay, UrbanShift is funded by the Global Environment Facility and led by UNEP in partnership with the World Resources Institute, ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability, C40 Cities, UNDP, the World Bank, and the Asian Development Bank. UrbanShift supports cities in 9 countries to adopt integrated approaches to urban development, building an equitable zero-carbon future for both people and planet. Next slide, please. So Energy Exchanges is a technical webinar series on the local energy transition, offering deep dives into solutions from technology, finance, and policy. Energy Exchanges are supported by the 100% Renewable Cities and Regions Roadmap Project, which works with local governments in Argentina, Indonesia, and Kenya in developing a roadmap towards 100% renewable energy to support the effective implementation of local climate and energy action. This project is funded by the International Climate Initiative. So I'll share upcoming updates from both UrbanShift and Energy Exchanges at the end. Next slide. So coming to our discussion for today, I'm excited to introduce our panelists who come from different backgrounds of expertise and are here to share their insights with us. So we are joined by Deepa Solanki, a senior advisor at the Coalition, UNEP, Fen Li, Chief Engineer of Shenzhen Institute of Building Research, and the Deputy Secretary General of EcoCity Research Committee of Chinese Society for Urban Studies, Tanmay Tatkat, the Director of Environmental Design Solutions based in India, Melanie Slade, Senior Program Manager, Energy Efficiency in Emerging Economies at the International Energy Agency, and Rohit Sen, the Head of Sustainable Energy at ICLEI World Secretariat, who will be moderating the discussion. So to get us started, I'd like to invite Deepa Solanki to share her ideas on the topic and set the scene for our discussion today. Deepa, the floor is yours.
Many thanks, Karishma. Great. Hello and welcome all. I would like to begin by thanking the UrbanShift team and ICLEI Energy Exchanges for organising this webinar on urban cooling. I'm delighted to be here today. My name is Deepa Solanki and I'm a senior advisor to UNEP's Cool Coalition, and today I am going to speak to you about what cities can do to beat the heat and the important work that the Cool Coalition and partners are doing to improve efficiency and promote increased access to sustainable cooling. The UNEP-led Cool Coalition is a global multi-stakeholder network working across 130 partners, including governments, cities, academia, and civil society groups, who are facilitating knowledge exchange, advocacy, and joint action towards a rapid global transition to efficient and climate-friendly cooling. Next slide, please. As I'm sure you're all aware, heat waves have been making headlines across the globe. In April and May of this year, temperatures in Southeast Asia reached levels never experienced before by most of the countries in the region. Thailand saw its hottest day in history at 45.4 degrees Celsius in April, and Vietnam's all-time record was broken in early May. This June was also the hottest June that's ever been recorded in history. Nowhere are cooling measures more important than in cities, which are heating up at twice the global average rate due to the urban heat island effect. By 2100, cities worldwide could warm by an average of 4 degrees Celsius, which puts the world's poorest people at the highest risk. With rising temperatures and more frequent and intense heat waves expected to be the new normal, cooling is no longer a luxury and an absolute necessity. Next slide, please. However, the more we cool, the more we heat the planet. Cooling is a top driver of electricity and peak demand, and it's already straining our grids. By 2050, the energy requirement for space cooling is predicted to grow by 300%. By 2050, there's also a projected 4.5 billion air conditioners to be in use, which is a mind-boggling figure, resulting in emissions from air conditioning to account for a 0.5 degrees Celsius rise in temperatures by the end of the century. So without strong policy action, emissions from the sector will double by 2030 and triple by 2050 from 7% today. Simply put, growth in cooling is driving climate change, and that itself is increasing the need for more cooling. We can't go about cooling our planet with the business as usual approach. We need to accelerate the transition towards sustainable cooling to reduce GHG emissions, protect against heat stress, but also to enable people to work productively, reduce food loss, and enhance access to healthcare and vaccines. The next slide, please. Fortunately, there are a lot of solutions at our fingertips for cities. UNEP and partners launched the Beating the Heat Sustainable Cooling Handbook at COP26, which you can see on screen. And it provides detailed guidance to help the world's cities address warming while also cutting emissions and increasing city resilience. The handbook can be accessed by the link on the screen, and it offers a number of potential solutions for municipal leaders on how to keep our cities cooler, using less power and mitigating the urban heat island effect. Municipal leaders will need to embrace many measures, including smarter building design and urban design. For example, district cooling, a network of pipes that provides cooling to multiple buildings, is 5 to 10 times more energy efficient than conventional cooling. District cooling lowers CO2 emissions and operating costs and improves load balancing at peak hours, allowing the integration of renewables. Could we go on to the previous slide, please? Perfect. Sorry, no. There we are. Similarly, more efficient air conditioners cut CO2 emissions from space cooling in half, which combined with cleaner power resources can radically reduce overall emissions and improve air quality. We can also resurface our cities so that they are made from lighter coloured construction materials that shed heat rather than absorb it. And this measure could reduce temperatures by up to 5 degrees Celsius. The Cool Coalition and its partners are adopting many of the solutions in the Beating the Heat handbook to support cities across India, Cambodia, and Vietnam. I can share more information on this in the chat after this discussion, but one thing to also flag is that the Cool Coalition and the Adrienne Ash Rockefeller Foundation Resilience Centre has also launched an online heat action platform that makes it easy for policymakers and planners to identify the solutions that are most relevant to them. I'll paste this and other things in the chat function afterwards. Next slide, please. Another initiative that's been launched by UNEP's Cool Coalition and partners to promote climate-friendly and efficient cooling in cities is the Beat the Heat Nature for Cool Cities Challenge. Nature-based cooling solutions can help cities reduce the demand for active cooling and also increase urban resilience in coping with extreme temperatures and heat waves. Building design with passive and nature-based features offers great potential for mitigation adaptation. This includes planting more urban forests and parks in the cities that we live in. A street lined with trees can be 3 degrees Celsius cooler than one without, and green roofs can cut energy use by 10 to 15%. The Beat the Heat Challenge aims to support a cohort of cities to implement nature-based solutions to deliver heat resilience, cooling, and energy efficiency benefits. We are primarily doing this by targeting secondary cities in developing countries where there may potentially be a lack of finance and awareness to implement nature-based solutions for cooling. We are therefore inviting cities in low and middle-income countries to apply to the challenge, and by doing so, there's the potential to secure technical and financial assistance to help implement nature-based solutions for cooling. The proposals will be evaluated by UNEP and partners based on a defined criteria, and through this we'll identify a cohort of 8 to 10 winning cities, and these will receive project-funded incubation grants and technical assistance to deliver on the challenge objectives. More information on the challenge and how to apply can be found by scanning the QR code on the screen now or emailing me at the address on the screen. And just to note that challenge winners and those that apply to the city will also be profiled at COP28 this year. Next slide, please. Most importantly on this, coordinated international action is critical on efficiency alongside the refrigerant transition under the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol can help the world avoid the equivalent of 4 to 8 years of total annual GHG emissions by 2050. The United Arab Emirates COP28 presidency is championing a global cooling pledge, which will also feature prominently at COP28. The pledge is key to raising ambition and international cooperation on improving energy efficiency and increasing access on sustainable cooling through collective targets. It's a voluntary pledge and it contains a menu of policy actions ranging from nature-based solutions that we talked about previously to sustainable cold chains to appliance efficiency and innovation investment. UNEP is supporting this critical effort through our Cool Coalition, and we're calling on cities and countries today to join the pledge and mobilise peers to join the pledge on the road to COP28 and make this year's COP a cool COP. In order to learn more about the pledge and to learn how to sign up to it, please do scan the QR code to see the latest version. It's going to be finalised by the end of this month, and then we'll be working with the COP28 team to mobilise commitments to it till the end of the year. Thank you very much, and I wish you all a wonderful panel discussion going forward.
Thank you very much, Deepa. That was fantastic. You set the scene perfect for us, talking about the challenge that we have today, the concerns with the heating, temperatures rising, and how many impacts that we are seeing around the world, especially in Global South. Also talking about some of the initiatives and actions that many partners are doing, the initiative led by UNEP and so on. That's perfect. Let me invite my expert panelists, Melanie, Fenley, and Tanmay, to also join me in this discussion, where I want to take this forward and dive a bit more deeper into the various aspects of energy efficiency, building design, nature-based solutions, and so on, and see what from their experience and expertise they see as the solutions, the innovations that we can highlight for the challenges we see with urban cooling, with the temperatures rising and the demand for cooling increasing. Let me start with you, Melanie. I mean, you have more than 30 years of experience now working in various projects related to energy and energy efficiency in various parts of the world, especially focusing in global South countries, even in Southeast Asia, South Asian countries. What would be good for us to know is if you can walk us through some of the successful, or let's say key policy instruments that are crucial for sustainable urban cooling.
Many thanks, Rohit. Many thanks for the introduction. It's great to be here today with you all to talk about this really critical subject at a time when many parts of the world feel like that they're melting, particularly those that are perhaps not accustomed to doing so as well. So here in Europe, it's really, really quite unseasonably hot. So our observations, and Deepa was great. It was kind to introduce some of the IEA numbers in her introduction. The projections for the growth in electricity demand in particular through cooling. But what I would say is our observation is that with the appropriate sort of policy actions, we can make a difference, and that we're of the opinion that using technologies that we have today, that we can, particularly in many areas, and cooling is one of them, we can actually halve that potential growth in energy demand if we use what we know in the here and now. So we don't have to invent anything new in order to do this. We just need to bring what we know is available into the market. And I know that this is a city-based conversation in a way, but we're very interested in the link between national policy and how that can be reinforced, implemented at a local level. We need this kind of link to exist. And so I'll start with national policies where local governments can play an important role. And we're great believers in policy packages. So we need our regulation, our information, our incentives all to work together. If you see these policies being designed independently, they often have counterproductive effects. So they really do need to be designed as a package to work together from the start, regardless of the stakeholders and the implementers. So we need to define the roles of everybody in that process. Just one example on buildings that has been particularly successful and that would be very useful in the region is the approach Australia has taken to energy efficiency in existing buildings. There's a system of measurement for the performance of an existing building. That's, in this case, is known as neighbours. That leads to a star rating. It requires qualified auditors to give that process. Then there's a requirement all across the country, both so it's state and federal, for every building that's sold or leased of a certain size to have a rating declared at the point of sale. So this is, in this case, it's a star rating. So that in turn drives the market for the auditors. It makes a business plan for the auditors, and gives us this star rating. And then governments, be they national or local, are applying incentives to those ratings. So the federal government, for example, won't occupy buildings that are less than a 5-star rating. And this is happening in states as well. So we're seeing that that's pulling forward the retrofit and the increased performance requirements, because people see, or owners of buildings see, government as being a great tenant. So there are all sorts of, once you've got the measurement and performance infrastructure in place, there are all sorts of incentives you can apply to that. And I would suggest that it's best to have that coherent system, so that you might have different cities in a country applying different types of incentives depending on their motivations. But if they're applying them to a system which reinforces a national policy, then everything is working together. So we see that with buildings, and we can see that with appliances. So if you take cooling, if you take air conditioning, you can have your minimum energy performance standards. You have your energy labels and the categories for your labels. We think of them as a ladder. They could imply what future minimum performance standards would look like. And then you have your incentives. So again, different cities, different parts of government, different stakeholders can use different incentives. But if they use them to pull products through that process, then they reinforce the national policy, and they aggregate markets for efficient products and services. And if you have these big markets across a country, across a region, then you can drive the profitability of these products and services. And I'll stop there for now.
Thanks, Melanie. I pick up one of the points which you mentioned about the buildings, as it is one of the core focus in here. And I wanted to jump to the building design part and ask Tanmay of some important lessons that you've learned in your vast career with the experience and expertise on how we can draw from local and traditional climate-specific building designs, whether it is passive cooling or something else that could help in integrating, these solutions from the energy side and so on.
Thank you, Rohit. If we look at this region, we have one of the most difficult regions in terms of climate, with high humidity, temperatures. But for centuries, people have worked, existed, and thrived without air conditioning. So there is something to be learned in how we have built our cities, built our buildings, and how our lifestyles were adapted to the climatic conditions. So there are a lot of lessons to be learned from building design to, essentially I can summarize it in, let's say, 3 or 4 points. One, which was essential to managing and effective cooling, is managing solar radiation. So whether it was the way the urban form and the layout of the buildings and the clusters, the street geometry, that affected both the shading of the streets, shading of the buildings, shading of openings, and the urban geometry and the streets also affected airflow, which in a way helped the natural ventilation within the buildings as well as surrounding areas. So one was this radiation, second was looking at ventilation. And the third very important part was creating in this large sort of swath of Southeast Asia, different techniques of creating microclimates. So you had, whether within a building, a courtyard that could be cool during the night, or an outdoor ventilated veranda that could be comfortable during certain seasons, or urban areas with water bodies and small ponds, which could create these patches of comfort. So this translated into a seamless integration of these strategies into outdoors and landscape for vegetation, surrounding area, and finally into the use of materials that were, I would say, non-massive, more timber, more things that did not retain heat and could be comfortable through the day. And our lifestyles, therefore, were adapted to this building. We had different spaces for day and night, different spaces for summer and winter. So I think there's a lot to be learned, and there are many examples of buildings now that are learning from this and adapting this in the modern context.
I mean, that's a very good point that you made, and we already see this. I mean, this design can be and these measures can be taken up in the new buildings construction with all the green labels and so on, with the ratings. What about existing buildings? Is there any measures that you would recommend for retrofitting in existing building stocks for this?
Sure. See, retrofits, depending on the type and the age of the building that we're talking about, retrofits are essential. You know, if we look at it in a traditional sense, where you look at retrofits or retro commissioning, which is more on the equipment based on building systems and other process and electrical system, that itself is essential. So if you have an older building with older cooling systems, for example, it's usually the most cost-effective thing is to retrofit your cooling system. Technologies change every 5 to 7 years. Over the period of time, efficiency of cooling systems drop. So it always makes sense, even financially, to upgrade and retrofit cooling systems. You also have upgrades now for adding better controls so that it's, whatever is the system that you have for cooling works better. There is, of course, the ultimate point of reducing the requirement of cooling by retrofitting the building envelope. So again, it's difficult to change the orientation or other things, but you can always look at reducing thermal gain and stopping leakages, right? So if we get insulation can be added definitely to the roof, sometimes to the walls as well easily. Air tightness can be increased so that you don't want unwanted infiltration when your cooling is on. And shading, as I said, controlling radiation is something that can always be added to any building. So, that's one really essential part of looking at retrofitting is reducing my thermal gains and requirement for cooling. And the other point, which Deep also talked about, is retrofitting to change the type of system. There are low energy cooling systems that can replace the conventional cooling system. There are hybrid systems. And at a different scale, there is the response to look at a small air conditioning system being replaced by a cooling as a service or a district cooling system. So these all options are available and in a way, I would think required for all existing and old buildings for retrofitting their cooling systems.
Thanks a lot. I mean, those are very interesting points and key measures. I think one of the things that gets highlighted from even from Melanie, what she said and what you're saying, that there is definitely a strong participation from the community, and at the same time, there is a strong need for policy interventions from different levels of governments. As we are focusing on cities, I wanted to come to Fen Lee over here and ask on local government. So how can local governments engage their communities in order to disseminate the message of efficient cooling and changing the behaviors? Whether it is, for example, opting for higher efficiency rated appliances, Tanmay just indicated. Can you mention a few critical things that the local governments can do, Fen?
Okay, and thank you, Chairman. I'm Li Fen, come from China. And just like the Deepa give us a very interesting presentation, and the other speakers and have discussed a lot of interesting topic. And the high temperature has been characterized as a climate disaster that challenges urban governance. Shenzhen, it's located in the southern China with hot summers and warm winters, and faces more severe risk of the high temperature and heat waves in recent years. And on July the 15th this year, the Shenzhen Health Commission reported that 2 people have died and the heat exhaustion with 20 days, and 60 people have been heat stroke. So the government would like to changing behaviors to reduce the energy consumption and environmental impacts. Here are several the possible measures. The first of one is establish a community cooperation mechanisms. The local government can establish a cooperation mechanism with the community to organize the activities for residents to participate in the planning. The second one is the high temperature warnings and suggest measures for community counterparts. And for example, we will work with the community planners to set up the summer cooling spots in the public space in communities and provide the public and guidance. The third one is pay attention to the special groups, such as the sanitations and workers and careers. We will promote the transformation of the modes from down to by hand to mechanism and set up the career station and sunshines, something like that. The fourth one, provide the president with sufficient water and electricity. Work with the energy companies to explore the innovative modes of using the electricity and encourage and guide to shift the peak loads of electricity consumption. And the fifth one, we also to made a contribution to the community leaders, and the community leaders, the volunteers will join in to become responsible for organizing the events, and they will distributing the informations, materials, and providing the advices to the community members, something like that. And the last one will provide make policy and measures. And the local government can offer incentive and publish the regulations to encourage the community residents to purchase the events, and also distributing the informations and the equipment, such as the energy efficient air conditioners and the energy saving light fixtures to improve the overall efficiency of energy use. Yeah, something like that. Thank you.
Thank you, Fanny. Those were really interesting points, and good to know what those measures that local governments and cities are taking and can be also adopted in other regions. I'm conscious of the time, so I also want to open the floor for the audience, and let's look at also the questions that are coming from the audience and engage them. From my side, I am also worried about the urban poor. The energy poverty is also on increase, not just in Southeast Asia, but also in the global north in many countries. So keeping in mind the urban poor, the energy poverty, Melanie, if I may come to you and ask about in the Southeast Asia region, what trends do you see in terms of tackling the efficient cooling challenges with respect to the actual practical issues on the ground, like urban poor, energy poverty?
It's a huge challenge, of course, for the region, but I think the biggest strength, if I may say, is the size of the market. So that market and the particularly in Southeast Asia, the ASEAN process, which requires cross-border trade of goods and services. It means that if a manufacturer produces really efficient appliances, they can sell them easily everywhere in ASEAN. With air conditioners, Thailand went from not much of a producer of air conditioners, the number 2 producer in the world after China. And lots of people don't realise that. But if you talk to the Thai government, they'll say that they did that because they saw this opportunity for this huge market. and they already had some manufacturing capacity. But they also saw that if they manufactured to what they saw to be in the higher requirements that were that were being called for in other parts of the world, they suddenly created this immense market for the manufacturers. And of course, they benefit from the jobs and the economic growth that's pulled in. So I think the market is the trick there. And the same can be applied. I mean, I mentioned the example of the policy packages for buildings earlier and linking the regulation, the incentive, the information and the incentives. That's all underpinned by having, qualified auditors, for example. So if you think in ASEAN, you could have a common measurement methodology for the performance of existing buildings, and of course new buildings too. Then you've all of a sudden you've got massive market for the services that are required, and therefore it's worth people developing skills and businesses associated with these things. So I'd say that's the number one point, is the market size. One of the innovations that has been touched upon, but we will need to see coming through much more strongly, is the concept of grid connected buildings, grid enabled buildings, and demand response ready appliances. So again, the technology, the capacity for absorbing technology in Southeast Asia is very, very strong. You've got very well qualified people, well educated people who are able to adopt new technologies, world class. So if you've got grid connected buildings and demand response enabled appliances, you can then balance your supply and demand. You can make use of the high degrees of solar energy when they're available, which happens luckily to be when you need your cooling. And you can balance these things in a way that means that you will not have to build out the energy system as rapidly or as dramatically as you would if you didn't take advantage of both the efficiency and then the demand response capacity of that Southeast Asia can kind of lead the world on, and actually provide solutions for the rest of the world will benefit from. But in terms of, but by doing that, they will drive costs down, and that will, of course, help everybody. Every energy bill will benefit from the cost being much lower than they would be if you didn't have this. Also, if you enable these systems and you have this, if you have this opportunity for incentivizing, you can, instead of perhaps using subsidies for everybody, course mechanisms that subsidize everybody, you can then target those subsidies on your more vulnerable parts of your communities. But in order to be able to do that, you need this system in place of having your regulations, having your information, and having your incentive base. So it comes back to those things for me. But I think all new buildings or all new building codes should have grid connected requirements in them. As Tanmay said, state of the art control systems. There's no excuse not to have those in new buildings now, and all new appliances should have demand response requirements built into the regulations as well. And that's how we create the mass markets.
Yes, very interesting. I pick up the word regulations, and I also want to welcome Deepa to join us for the discussion. If we can also focus the camera on Deepa to join us. Yep, perfect, thank you. Deepa, there are many questions that are coming up on the Q&A. There's one that I want to direct towards you. Question is, are there any policy or regulatory changes needed to incentivize urban cooling projects? And if so, what are they?
Thank you. So I just wanted to quickly touch and follow on from the last point made, which was around looking at regulation of air conditioning. So if we've got about 4.5 billion air conditioners that are projected to be in use by 2050, it would be, and every kind of building will have air conditioners within them. It is key for there to be policy and regulatory change to ensure that the worst offending and highest carbon emitting air conditioning units are banned from the market, and that we promote those kind of innovative models that may be at higher cost. And the only way that you can do that is through having regulation that bans those worst offenders.
Perfect, thanks. I wanted to go to Fen Li on this and wanted to ask regarding Shenzhen. I mean,
Yeah.
how is the city, Fen Li, addressing the extreme heat for those who may not have access to indoor cooling? No? Are they creating working on some nature-based solutions with creating blue or green spaces? And this is also important because, as I mentioned in the beginning, with the urban poor and the energy poverty rising, could you please tell us a few things from Shenzhen?
Okay, thank you. And I think it's a very good questions. And Shenzhen, it is a city that face extremely high temperature in China in summer, yeah, for now. And so the Dialog have ventilation corridors in the city, while avoiding the high-rise buildings with too dense distributions in the city. And you all know the Shenzhen is really a huge city, and there are around 2,000 million people in the city. So it would maintaining the natural airflow inside the building at the stage of design are well helpful for the cities to respond to the high temperature. So the urban planning, it will be very important. Consider the orientation of the building and roads and the material selections, etc., in urban planning to minimize the heat island effect, thus reducing the overall temperature. The second one is the building design. And we will optimize the building design and encourage to use the passive technology, just like the ICLEI said, to reduce the energy consumption, such as the natural ventilation and natural lighting. The buildings are encouraged to adopt efficient thermal insulation material and ventilation systems to reduce the indoor temperature. So in addition, the sunshade devices can be installed at the outside surface of the building to reduce the direct sunlight into the inside. And also, you just mentioned the blue and green space construction. Create more blue like the water and green vegetation spaces, such as the parks, the squares, the gardens, and so on, and promote the construction of the sponge cities. Yeah. And this place can provide a cooling environment to help people relax and calm in the hot weather, and also have some shade facilities and the rest station and water sources and the emergency shelter, the fountain, the water skate and cooling spray system, and also connection and interaction within the community. We will cooperate with the community organization and volunteer groups to pay attention to the vulnerable groups, and also have some education and publicity. So through the comprehensive application of the above measures, the Shenzhen can provide the effective cooling and protection measures at high temperature to people. Okay, and we can have the very detailed talk, but the time limit. Yeah, so we'll come maybe later.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Friendly. And I do see there's so many solutions, so many innovations, and so many things that one need to integrate in an approach. And also there are more interesting questions coming from the audience. I want to keep a question, like send an open question to the panel, and you're free to address as you wish. What are the key recommendations you would make for a city looking to promote cooling as a service and other energy services related to sustainable cooling? This is open to all of you. Anybody who would like to go first?
I'm happy to come in.
Yeah.
So I would, I think my top one would be, often cooling is kind of divided and led by a number of different ministries, so the Ministry of Environment, the Ministry of Energy, which can mean that it often lacks the direction or ownership that it needs at the government level. One thing that we found that can be very helpful with this is the development of a national cooling action plan as a policy tool and a kind of overarching policy framework that outlines what exactly the country is going to do, by what measures, and through when. And so a number of countries have recently either developed them or launched them, such as India and Kenya, and they have provided to be a really good strategy document to promote sustainable cooling.
May I, Rohit, just make a comment? One of the things that we've seen in the development of energy services generally, and it applies to cooling equally, and particularly cooling as a service, is that in some countries it's been necessary to change some quite established regulations to enable business models to work. So just a little example, China has the biggest energy services market in the world, has the biggest number of energy service companies. And it was necessary to change basic accounting regulations in order to enable that business model to work. The way that something that is provided as a service can be construed as leasing, for example, rather than taking over ownership. That means it's no longer a capital expenditure, it's an operating expenditure, and those things are taxed differently. So there are those sorts of kind of intricacies, and I won't go into detail, but those things have to be dealt with in order to enable certain business models to actually be legal in countries. So I would suggest that it's really important to capture those types of requirement in whatever country or region, because they tend to be national, these sorts of legal requirements, and make sure that any barriers that exist are dealt with, because otherwise you find some people trying to do pilots and spending a lot of resources on those pilots, and in fact they can't work because they can't work legally. You've seen some parts of the world make allowances for regulatory sandboxes, as they like to call them, for pilots, to kind of allow flexibility to try and establish what's needed. But just a word there on getting the right legal framework in place. Otherwise, it's not possible to do some of these things.
That's very important. Tanmay, would you like to add something?
Yes. So cooling as a service, if you see, technically it can be made per unit of cooling a lot more efficient than, let's say, a small room air conditioner or even a mid-size cooling system. So when I look at the overall feasibility and an environmental assessment of applicability, in the current context, wherever there is a high demand, a continuous demand for cooling as a service makes business sense, and people are doing it. There are energy service companies, and as Melanie said, there are challenges to a district-based system because there are jurisdiction issues and other, utility service models but it's getting more and more popular where a service provider comes to your building, which is cooling intensive, and says, okay, you don't need to worry about anything else. I'm just taking over your cooling system and providing you cooling as a service and that actually yields a lot of efficiency. The challenge is, if I look at the bulk of cooling for this region of the world, it's residential cooling. And the way majority of this residential cooling demand is growing, even though the number of installed air conditioners is large, we are still using one room at a time as required, which is actually a good thing that, we are not cooling the entire house. And so, but with that kind of a setup, it's very difficult to develop a profitable business model because you still have to invest in the entire infrastructure. And so we need to see that evolve. So, on a per unit cooling basis, I can get more efficiency, but on an annual basis, where somebody is using cooling for only, say, 30% of the time, for that population, this cooling as a service is yet to make sense financially or environmentally, I would say.
Perfect, thank you. And you can see this conversation is going along with so many variation of things and topics, and we can go on, and it seems we need more discussion. But I'm also conscious of the time. But I'll take try to squeeze in another question, because this is very interesting to me, and it's an open question. And I would request you all to briefly give your answer and also give your concluding remarks as the way forward, as you see, as the next steps for us, for local governments and cities. The question is, what are some of the cost-effective approaches for cities, especially those with limited budgets, to implement urban cooling initiatives? And this is open to the panel. Tanmay, you want to go, please?
Right. So, I mean, if I just look at the answer to the question on how can, if you don't have to go inside the building as a city, reduce urban heat islands, right? There are certain factors that are beyond our control, weather, cloud cover, etc. But there are many controllable factors which can reduce. So it is whether it is the compactness of the city, the design in terms of shading, urban canyons, the permeability of the surfaces that I have, the color of the roof that I can provide, the pavement and the road surfaces that can both be permeable and light colored. Those are actually very cost effective, very low cost solutions. And vegetation and the right use of water, I think, to change microclimates, especially where residential areas and vulnerable population is I think a good cost-effective first step.
Yes,
May I do it? Just to say, our world's changed because of the availability of much cheaper digital technologies, and we haven't talked about that much today. But just to say that Lifan talked about local energy communities and community-based energy projects that we're seeing develop around cities around the world, and these are providing really kind of cost-effective solutions to dealing with very local issues, but they're made even more doable by having digital technologies. So what cities can do potentially is to support the development of protocols for communications, for trading of power, even when people are locally generating power. These sorts of things can kind of reinforce local grids, and they can reduce bills, they can generate jobs. So just availing of the opportunities that these new digital technologies give us can be, quite low cost and really great for cities and local communities. But if you then go back to what I was saying earlier about the grid connected buildings and demand response appliances, if you can get those in place as well, then these digital opportunities, mushroom.
I'm happy to come in now. So I just wanted to reiterate Tanmai's point,
So
actually.
Only maybe we have Deepa first, and then we come to you.
Sure.
Deepa, please go ahead.
Yeah. So I just wanted to reiterate Tanmai's point around communal shading as a low-cost kind of cooling measure, and the reason is because those that are kind of most exposed to extreme heat and heat stress are those that are outside a lot. So those working in the formal sector, your street vendors, your kind of poor and marginalized or homeless communities. And so by offering communal shaded spaces, you're giving some respite from the heat to those that need it most. And then as my kind of concluding remark that was requested, I really do urge all cities to look at at the Global Cooling Pledge and see how they can sign up to it. And that has a list of measures that they can sign up to, some of which are optional and some are which are actually outlined specifically for subnational and local governments.
Great. Yes, Fenley, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. And I just want to mention, so I would like to suggest the government will show some typical demonstration, such as in our IBR building. And in our building, we do the ventilation monitoring, then we will reduce the energy consumption. It's around 30% to 40%. So we will reduce the air conditioning. And also, I think the realization and the training is also very important. And like in the southern China, the older generation of the local people would like the natural ventilation. They just like to open the window, let the wind in. But the younger generation, they more like air conditioning. They think they set the temperature more lower will be more comfortable. So we need to go from the next generation to the harmony of nature. When the green becomes the belief, the low carbon will be the results. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So I believe I can summarize and conclude by saying that cooling strategies in urban areas are crucial for mitigating and adverse effects of urban heat islands, as we have seen improving overall quality of life and building more sustainable and resilient cities in the face of the climate change, as we've all discussed and the points that were raised. These strategies often we have seen involve a combination of physical changes, policy interventions, which was talked about a lot and raised by all the panelists, and very important, the community engagement efforts, including behavioral change and practice and so on. I believe we need to keep in mind that effectiveness of cooling strategies can also vary based on factors like local climate, geography, and the specific urban context. I believe going from energy to energy efficiency, renewables, nature-based solutions, we need a holistic approach that takes into account that unique characteristics of each city. I think that is crucial and for successful urban cooling initiatives. And most important, I think, across all levels of the government, all other stakeholders, the collaboration and partnership is key. And active participation as well of all stakeholders is essential to achieve that sustainable urban cooling target. and also promote that sustainable development in our cities and communities. With that, I would like to thank you all for this amazing panel, sharing your experience and expertise on the topic of urban cooling. As I said, this is a very wide, big topic which needs more discussion, especially for the way ahead to the COP this year, as Deepa mentioned, the Cool COP. So we keep our efforts on, also at ICLEI, working with the cities and mobilizing them under various initiatives and activities, whether it is 100% renewables, whether it is nature-based solutions, and so on. With that, I thank you all, and I hand over to Karishma.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I think that was a great discussion. And thanks to all our panelists for taking the time to join us and sharing their expertise. And of course, to our attendees for their excellent questions. So coming up, we have the Urban Shift Asia Forum in New Delhi in September, where we will also be launching our online City Academy modules on 8 topics on urban sustainable development. So this is a great resource that we welcome you to take advantage of. And if you want to stay up to date with the latest on the Urban Shift project, you can sign up to our newsletter or connect to us via email or social media. The next Energy Exchanges webinar will be on August 30th on energy efficient buildings. So do join us there to continue some of the conversation from today. And we've also shared the link in the chat box. Next slide, please. So on behalf of the Urban Shift project and Energy Exchanges, I thank you all for joining us today and have a great rest of your day.